In the shadowed annals of English royal history, few stories have captured the imagination and horror of generations quite like the fate of the princes in the Tower. At the center of this mystery lies 12-year-old Edward V, a boy who inherited the most powerful throne in Europe, only to vanish into the stone corridors of the Tower of London like morning mist, leaving behind nothing but whispered rumors, political calculations, and the echo of footsteps that grew fainter each day until they disappeared altogether. This is not simply the tale of a missing child, though the disappearance of any young life carries its own profound tragedy. This is the story of how political ambition can devour innocence, how the machinery of power can grind up even those it was designed to protect, and how a kingdom's desperate need for stability became the instrument of its future king's destruction. What happened to Edward V in the summer of 1483 represents more than royal murder. It was the systematic erasure of legitimacy itself, a calculated dismantling of the divine right that was supposed to protect crowned heads from the very mortals who served them. The boy who would never truly reign began his tragic journey to oblivion not in the tower's depths, but in the sunlit chambers of Ludlow Castle, where he received news that would seal his fate. On that April morning, in 1483, when word arrived that his father Edward IV had died suddenly after a brief illness, the 12-year-old prince could not have imagined that his inheritance would become his death sentence. The crown that should have secured his future instead painted a target on his young life, transforming him from protected heir to expendable obstacle in the span of a few terrible weeks. To understand the horror of Edward's disappearance, we must first comprehend the world that shaped him, a realm torn apart by decades of civil warfare that had turned brother against brother and reduced the noble art of kingship to a blood-soaked game of survival. The England of 1483 bore the scars of the Wars of the Roses, that devastating conflict that had consumed the better part of a century and left the political landscape littered with the corpses of kings, queens, and countless nobles who had chosen the wrong side in dynastic struggles that rewrote the rules of power with each victory and defeat. Edward V was born into this world of violence. On November 2nd, 1470, the eldest son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, his arrival celebrated as the answer to England's prayers for dynastic stability. His father had seized the throne in 1461 through military might and political cunning, overthrowing the ineffective Henry VI and establishing the Yorkist claim to the crown. But victory in medieval England was always temporary, and Edward IV's reign was marked by constant threats from rival claimants, rebellious nobles, and the ever-present possibility that yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's executioner. The young prince grew up in the magnificent court of his father, surrounded by the pageantry and luxury that befitted the heir to England's throne, yet always shadowed by the knowledge that power was a prize that had to be defended daily. His education was befitting a future king, encompassing not only the traditional skills of warfare and statecraft, but also the scholarly pursuits that marked the Renaissance monarchy. Edward could read Latin fluently, understood the complexities of European diplomacy, and had been trained in the art of command that would be essential for ruling a kingdom still racked by factional divisions. At the age of 3, he had been established in his own household at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh borderlands, a strategic placement that served multiple purposes. Ludlow was far enough from London to protect him from the immediate dangers of court politics, yet close enough to the Welsh frontier to give him practical experience in governing one of England's most challenging regions. Here, under the guidance of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the young prince learned the practical arts of rulership while being groomed for the responsibilities that awaited him. The household at Ludlow was more than a princely residence. It was a miniature kingdom designed to prepare Edward for the realities of royal power. He held his own court, heard petitions from local nobles and commoners, and learned to navigate the complex web of personal relationships that held medieval England together. His days were filled with lessons in law, theology, and statecraft, interrupted by the physical training that would prepare him for the military leadership that every medieval king was expected to provide. By the time he reached 12, Edward the Vythe possessed a sophistication that would have been remarkable in any adult, let alone a child. Yet for all his preparation, nothing could have equipped Edward for the speed with which his world would collapse following his father's unexpected death. Edward IV died on April 9th, 1483, at Westminster Palace, his passing so sudden that many suspected poison, though modern historians believe it was more likely the result of pneumonia or typhoid fever that overwhelmed his constitution after years of indulgence and stress. The king, who had ruled through force of personality and military success, left behind a kingdom that was deceptively stable on the surface, but fractured beneath by the same factional divisions that had plagued England for generations. The news of his father's death reached Edward at Ludlow on April 14th, delivered by messengers who brought not only grief, but the crushing weight of royal responsibility. At 12 years old, Edward V was now King of England, Lord of Ireland, and claimant to the throne of France, inheriting dominions that stretched from the Scottish borders to the English territories in Calais. But crowns, as Edward would soon discover, were easier to inherit than to keep, and the very legitimacy that seemed to protect him would become the weapon used to destroy him. The immediate aftermath of Edward IV's death revealed the fragility of the political arrangements that had maintained the Yorkist dynasty. The dead king's will, which has not survived to the present day, reportedly named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector during Edward V's minority, a seemingly natural arrangement given Richard's loyalty and military experience. However, the Woodville family, led by the Queen Dowager Elizabeth Woodville and her brother Earl Rivers, had other plans for the young king's future, plans that would set in motion the chain of events leading to Edward's destruction. The Woodvilles represented everything that the old nobility despised about the new order that Edward IV had created. Elizabeth Woodville had been a relatively minor noble, a widow with 2 sons from her previous marriage, when she caught the eye of Edward IV and somehow convinced him to marry her in secret. This unprecedented royal marriage to a commoner had scandalized the establishment and created lasting resentment among the great families who felt their own bloodlines were superior to that of the upstart queen. Worse still, Elizabeth had used her position to advance her numerous relatives, creating a Woodville network that seemed to threaten the traditional balance of power in the kingdom. Now, with Edward IV dead and their young nephew on the throne, the Woodvilles saw an opportunity to consolidate their control over the monarchy and eliminate their rivals once and for all. They moved quickly to arrange Edward V's coronation for May 4th, hoping to present the kingdom with a fait accompli before their enemies could organize opposition. A crowned king would be far more difficult to challenge than a boy whose legitimacy remained uncertain, and Elizabeth Woodville understood that speed was essential to securing her family's future. But the Woodvilles had underestimated the determination and cunning of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man whose loyalty to his brother had been absolute, but whose ambition had remained carefully hidden beneath years of faithful service. Richard was not content to serve as a mere regent, watching from the sidelines as the Woodvilles used his nephew to advance their own interests. He had spent his adult life in the shadow of his more charismatic brothers, fighting their battles and advancing their interests. But now he saw an opportunity to step into the light and claim the recognition he believed he had earned through years of sacrifice. The confrontation between Richard and the Woodvilles came to a head at Stony Stratford on April 29th, where the Duke of Gloucester intercepted Edward V's journey to London. The young king was travelling in the company of Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters, but Richard had not come alone. He brought with him Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, one of the most powerful nobles in England, and a man with his own grievances against the Woodville ascendancy. The meeting at Stony Stratford was conducted with all the courtesy that medieval politics demanded, but beneath the polite exchanges lay the steel of determined men willing to use violence to achieve their goals. What transpired during those crucial hours at Stony Stratford would determine not only Edward V's fate, but the future of the English monarchy itself. Richard and Buckingham dined cordially with Earl Rivers and the young king's half-brother Richard Grey, engaging in the sort of political conversation that had become second nature to men who lived at the intersection of power and danger. They discussed the upcoming coronation, the challenges facing the new reign, and the arrangements that would need to be made for the young king's government. But when dawn broke on April 30th, the facade of cooperation shattered as Richard's true intentions became clear. Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and Sir Thomas Vaughan, the young king's chamberlain, awoke to find themselves under arrest, charged with treason against the crown, and hustled away to imprisonment in the north. Edward V, barely comprehending what was happening, found himself surrounded by his uncle's men and effectively a prisoner, though Richard maintained the fiction that he was acting to protect the young king from the dangerous influence of his Woodville relatives. The boy who had awakened as the King of England discovered by evening that he was little more than a pawn in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. The seizure of Edward V at Stony Stratford represented the first move in what would become one of history's most brilliant and ruthless political campaigns. Richard had not simply captured his nephew, he had decapitated the Woodville network in a single stroke, removing the key figures who might have organized resistance to his authority. More importantly, he had gained physical control of the one person whose legitimacy could justify his actions or condemn them. As long as Edward V remained in his uncle's custody, Richard could claim to be acting in the young king's best interests, protecting him from the very people who had supposedly corrupted his father's reign. The journey from Stony Stratford to London took on the character of a royal progress, with Richard carefully orchestrating every detail to present himself as the loyal protector of his nephew's interests. Towns along the route were instructed to prepare celebrations for the young king, and Richard made sure that Edward was visible to the crowds who gathered to cheer their new monarch. Yet those who looked closely might have noticed that the boy king seemed subdued, his natural enthusiasm dampened by the sudden disappearance of his trusted companions and the increasingly clear reality that his uncle's protection felt suspiciously like captivity. On May 19th, Edward V took up residence in the Tower of London, the ancient fortress that served as both royal palace and state prison, its massive walls and strategic position commanding the approach to London from the Thames. Richard presented this arrangement as temporary and necessary, explaining that the Tower was the traditional residence for monarchs awaiting coronation, and that the young king would be safer there than anywhere else in the kingdom. The explanation was reasonable enough on its surface, and few dared to question the Lord Protector's judgment, but those familiar with the Tower's dual nature understood that there was often little difference between a guest and a prisoner within its walls. The Tower of London in 1483 was a complex of buildings that had grown organically over the centuries, its original Norman keep surrounded by additional structures that served various functions within the royal administration. The White Tower, built by William the Conqueror, dominated the complex with its massive stone walls and small windows, while newer additions provided more comfortable accommodations for royal residents. Edward V was housed in comfortable apartments appropriate to his rank, but comfort could not disguise the fact that the tower's primary function was containment, and its thick walls kept people in as effectively as they kept enemies out. During his first weeks in the tower, Edward V maintained the routine of kingship, receiving visitors, conducting business, and preparing for the coronation that had been rescheduled for June 22nd. Richard continued to act the part of the loyal protector, issuing orders in the young king's name and maintaining the constitutional fiction that Edward remained the source of all governmental authority. Parliament was summoned to meet 3 days after the scheduled coronation, and preparations proceeded for what should have been one of the great ceremonial occasions of the medieval calendar. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, Richard was laying the groundwork for a transformation that would shock even those accustomed to the brutal realities of medieval politics. The key to Richard's strategy lay not in force, though he had positioned troops strategically around London, but in law and precedent. Medieval monarchy derived its authority from divine sanction, expressed through the complex rituals of coronation and confirmed by the acceptance of the kingdom's nobles and commons. But this same system provided mechanisms for challenging royal authority when circumstances warranted, and Richard understood that legitimacy could be undermined as well as confirmed through the proper application of legal and constitutional procedures. On June 16th, Edward V was joined in the Tower by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, a 9-year-old boy whose presence would provide both comfort to the lonely king and additional leverage for their uncle's increasingly apparent ambitions. Young Richard had been staying with his mother, Queen Dowager Elizabeth Woodville, in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, where she had fled with her remaining children after learning of her brother's arrest and her eldest son's captivity. The extraction of the young Duke from sanctuary represented another careful step in Richard's campaign, accomplished through a combination of legal argument and implicit threat that left the Queen Mother no choice but to surrender her son. The reunion of the two brothers in the Tower was presented as an act of kindness, allowing the young king to have the companionship of his closest sibling during the stressful period before his coronation. Contemporary observers noted that both boys seemed relieved to be together, and for a brief moment it appeared that their uncle's arrangements might indeed serve their best interests. They were seen playing in the Tower's gardens, practicing archery, and engaging in the sorts of activities that any children of their age might enjoy. Yet even these innocent moments carried an undertone of tragedy for those who understood the precariousness of their situation. The presence of both boys in the Tower provided Richard with maximum flexibility for whatever plans he was formulating, but it also created a terrible responsibility. Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were not merely children. They were living symbols of legitimate royal authority, their very existence a challenge to anyone who might seek to claim the throne through other means. In the brutal calculus of medieval politics, they represented both immense value and deadly danger, pawns whose capture might win the game, but whose elimination might be necessary to prevent future challenges. As June progressed toward the scheduled coronation date, those who moved in the circles of power began to sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the arrangements being made for Edward V's reign. Richard's behavior grew increasingly erratic, postponing meetings, cancelling plans, and surrounding himself with northerners whose loyalty was to him personally rather than to the crown. The Woodville supporters who remained free found themselves marginalized and threatened, while traditional nobles struggled to understand what role they would play in the new dispensation. Most disturbing of all, access to the young king became increasingly restricted, with even his closest relatives finding it difficult to gain audiences with the boy they had expected to serve. The coronation scheduled for June 22nd never took place, cancelled at the last moment, as Richard prepared to reveal the full extent of his ambitions. Instead of crowning his nephew, the Lord Protector would launch the final phase of his campaign for the throne, a masterpiece of political manipulation that would transform him from loyal regent to anointed king while painting his actions as reluctant necessity rather than naked ambition. The fate of Edward V would be sealed not by assassins creeping through darkened corridors, but by lawyers arguing in public forums, their words more deadly than any blade because they struck at the very foundation of the young king's right to rule. The horror of what was about to unfold lay not in its violence, but in its cold legality, a demonstration that even the most sacred bonds of family and loyalty could be dissolved by those clever enough to find the proper justification for their ambitions. The morning of June 13th, 1483, dawned with deceptive tranquility over the Tower of London, the sun casting long shadows across the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal triumph and tragedy. Within the White Tower's council chamber, the most powerful men in England were gathering for what they believed would be a routine meeting to discuss the upcoming coronation of Edward V. Among them sat William Hastings, Baron Hastings, Lord Chamberlain of England, and perhaps the most trusted friend that Edward IV had ever possessed. He had served the Yorkist cause for over 2 decades, his loyalty unquestioned, his political instincts sharp, his position seemingly unassailable. By evening, his severed head would be displayed on a spike, and the last obstacle to Richard's ultimate ambitions would be permanently removed. The execution of William Hastings represented far more than the elimination of a political rival. It was the opening move in a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy the very foundations of Edward V's legitimacy. Hastings possessed something that made him uniquely dangerous to Richard's plans: intimate knowledge of Edward IV's personal life and relationships that could either confirm or destroy the allegations of bigamy that would soon be used to justify the young king's deposition. As the man who had served as Edward IV's closest confidant and companion in his more questionable pursuits, Hastings knew better than anyone the truth about his late master's romantic entanglements, making him either the perfect witness for Richard's claims or their most devastating opponent. The council meeting began with the usual formalities, discussions of administrative matters, and preparations for the coronation that had been rescheduled for June 22nd. Richard, playing his role as the dutiful protector, listened attentively to reports from various officials while maintaining the careful facade of a man reluctantly bearing the burdens of temporary authority. Yet those who observed him closely might have noticed a tension in his bearing, a watchfulness in his eyes that suggested deeper currents flowing beneath the surface of routine governance. The Duke of Buckingham sat nearby, his own role in the unfolding drama carefully choreographed, while around the table sat men whose fates would be decided in the next few hours. The transformation came with stunning suddenness, as Richard's demeanor shifted from careful courtesy to explosive accusation. According to the terrified witnesses who survived the encounter, the Lord Protector suddenly rose from his seat and began displaying his left arm, claiming that it had been withered by witchcraft practiced against him by Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her supposed accomplice, Jane Shore, the beautiful former mistress of Edward IV, who had more recently become involved with Hastings himself. The accusation was as absurd as it was terrifying, given that Richard's arm had been withered since birth. But in the supercharged atmosphere of the council chamber, rationality became irrelevant as armed men burst through the doors at a prearranged signal. The scene that followed was a masterpiece of calculated theatre, designed not merely to eliminate Hastings, but to terrorize the remaining councillors into complete submission. As Richard pointed his good arm at Hastings and denounced him as a traitor conspiring against the rightful government, soldiers surrounded the shocked Lord Chamberlain, while his fellow councillors sat frozen in their seats. There was no trial, no opportunity for defense, no moment of legal process that might have slowed the machinery of destruction that Richard had set in motion. Within minutes, Hastings was being dragged from the chamber toward his death, his protests and denials lost in the chaos of what had become less a political meeting than a perfectly executed ambush. The execution itself was conducted with a brutality that reflected both Richard's urgency and his determination to send an unmistakable message to anyone who might consider opposing his will. Hastings was dragged to Tower Green, where no scaffold had been prepared because none had been planned in advance. Instead, he was forced to kneel beside a piece of timber that had been left by workmen making repairs to the building, his head positioned over this makeshift block while a soldier raised his sword. The man who had once been among the most powerful nobles in England died like a common criminal, his blood soaking into the dirt, while his killer wiped the blade clean and walked away without ceremony. The speed and savagery of Hastings' execution sent shockwaves through the remaining members of the council and the broader political establishment, but it also served Richard's purposes perfectly by demonstrating that no one, regardless of their rank or past service, was immune from his displeasure. More importantly, it eliminated the one man who possessed both the knowledge and the credibility to challenge the extraordinary claims that Richard was preparing to make about his brother's marriage and the legitimacy of his nephews. With Hastings dead, the last independent voice that might have contradicted Richard's version of events had been permanently silenced. The other men arrested during the council meeting, including Archbishop Thomas Rotherham, Bishop John Morton, and several minor officials, were spared immediate execution, but found themselves imprisoned in various strongholds around London, their detention serving as both punishment and insurance against future opposition. These men had been guilty of nothing more than listening to Hastings' concerns about Richard's increasingly autocratic behavior. But in the new dispensation that was emerging, even passive association with potential resistance had become a capital offense. Their imprisonment served notice that Richard's tolerance for dissent had reached its absolute limit. In the immediate aftermath of Hastings' execution, Richard moved quickly to consolidate control over the apparatus of government and to begin the propaganda campaign that would justify his most audacious step yet. London's aldermen and guild leaders were summoned to hear Richard's explanation of recent events, where they were presented with carefully prepared evidence of the alleged conspiracy against his life. The documentation was convincing enough to satisfy men who had little choice but to accept whatever explanations were offered, and their public endorsement of Richard's actions provided the veneer of popular support that legitimized what was essentially a military coup. But the elimination of Hastings was merely the opening movement in a complex symphony of political manipulation that would reach its crescendo 9 days later. On June 22nd, the date originally set for Edward V's coronation, the people of London were instead treated to a very different sort of spectacle. Dr. Ralph Shah, a respected theologian and brother of the city's mayor, mounted the pulpit at St. Paul's Cross to deliver a sermon that would shatter the foundations of the Yorkist dynasty and provide Richard with the legal justification he needed to claim the throne for himself. Shah's sermon, entitled "Bastard Slips Shall Not Take Deep Root," was a masterpiece of theological argument and political propaganda that attacked Edward V's legitimacy on multiple fronts. The primary accusation was shocking in its implications. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid from the beginning because the king had already been contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. According to canon law, such a pre-contract was as binding as marriage itself, making Edward's subsequent union with Elizabeth Woodville bigamous and their children illegitimate bastards with no claim to the throne. Lady Eleanor Butler was the perfect choice for this explosive revelation because she had died in 1468, 15 years before the crisis of 1483, making her unavailable to confirm or deny the allegations. She had been a woman of noble birth and appropriate rank for such a connection with Edward IV, her father having been one of England's most distinguished military commanders. More importantly, her death meant that she could not contradict whatever story Richard's supporters chose to tell about her relationship with the late king, turning her memory into a weapon against the very dynasty she had allegedly been connected to. The evidence for this supposed pre-contract was provided by Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, a man whose credibility had been seriously compromised by his previous conflicts with the Woodville family, and whose motivation for supporting Richard's claims was transparently self-serving. Stillington claimed to have performed the ceremony that joined Edward IV and Eleanor Butler in a binding commitment, though he had waited nearly 20 years to reveal this earth-shattering information, and had chosen to do so only at the precise moment when it would serve Richard's political needs. The timing was so convenient as to strain credibility, but in the volatile atmosphere of 1483, skepticism was a luxury that few could afford. The theological and legal arguments supporting Richard's claims were complex enough to confuse laypeople while appearing sufficiently scholarly to impress those who lacked detailed knowledge of canon law. Shah explained that even if Eleanor Butler's death in 1468 had technically ended Edward's first marriage, his subsequent union with Elizabeth Woodville remained invalid, because it had been contracted while the first commitment was still in effect. The children born of this adulterous relationship were therefore illegitimate under both church and civil law, regardless of how long their parents had lived together or how widely their union had been accepted. Contemporary observers noted the dramatic effect that Shah's sermon had on the crowds gathered at St. Paul's Cross, though their reactions were more complex than simple acceptance or rejection of the allegations. Many in the audience were shocked by the audacity of the claims, while others found themselves convinced by the elaborate legal arguments that supported them. What mattered most, however, was not whether ordinary citizens believed the accusations, but whether the political establishment would accept them as sufficient justification for the extraordinary step of deposing an anointed king. The sermon was followed by similar presentations throughout London, with other preachers delivering variations of the same message to ensure maximum coverage of the allegations. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, addressed the city's Guildhall with his own version of the story, adding his considerable prestige to the campaign and demonstrating that Richard's claims had support among the highest levels of the nobility. These coordinated speeches created the appearance of a spontaneous revelation rather than a carefully orchestrated political campaign, though anyone with experience in medieval propaganda could recognize the sophisticated planning behind the apparently random emergence of similar stories from multiple sources. The speed with which these allegations spread throughout London and beyond revealed the extensive network of supporters that Richard had assembled during his weeks as Lord Protector. Messengers carried the news to every corner of England, while local officials received detailed instructions on how to present the information to their own communities. The machinery of government that had once served Edward IV now worked systematically to destroy his reputation and legitimacy, turning the very institutions that should have protected the young king into instruments of his destruction. As news of the alleged pre-contract spread, political figures throughout England faced an agonizing choice between loyalty to their anointed sovereign and submission to what appeared to be an unstoppable political revolution. Many who had initially supported Edward V found themselves reconsidering their positions as the implications of the allegations became clear. If the charges were true, then supporting Edward's claim would mean defending a bastard's usurpation of the rightful heir's inheritance. If they were false, then opposing them would mean challenging a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to execute his enemies without trial or mercy. The legal and constitutional crisis created by these allegations was unprecedented in English history, though Richard's supporters were careful to cite historical precedents that seemed to support their position. They pointed to cases where marriages had been annulled for similar reasons, and argued that the Church's teachings about the indissolubility of marriage contracts provided clear guidance for the current situation. More importantly, they emphasized that failing to address these allegations would leave England with a king whose legitimacy would always be questioned, creating the potential for future civil wars and dynastic disputes. Behind the theological arguments and legal precedents lay a more fundamental question about the nature of royal authority and the sources of political legitimacy in medieval England. If Edward V's kingship derived solely from his birth and divine appointment, then human laws about marriage and legitimacy should be irrelevant to his claim. But if royal authority ultimately depended on acceptance by the nobility and commons, then allegations that undermined confidence in the king's bloodline could indeed justify his removal from the throne, regardless of the truth or falsehood of the specific charges. The young king himself, confined within the Tower of London and increasingly isolated from the outside world, could only watch helplessly as the foundations of his authority crumbled around him. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward V understood what was happening to him, despite his youth, and that he grew increasingly distressed as visitors became fewer and access to information about the outside world was systematically restricted. The boy who had once been the focus of an entire kingdom's hopes and ambitions found himself transformed overnight into a political liability whose very existence had become problematic for those who now controlled the machinery of government. His younger brother Richard, Duke of York, remained largely innocent of the adult politics that were destroying their family, but his presence in the Tower, alongside Edward V, created additional complications for their uncle's plans. The younger boy represented both a potential alternative to Edward's claim and a possible focal point for future resistance to Richard's rule. As long as both princes remained alive and in custody, they would continue to pose a threat to Richard's security, their very existence a reminder of the legitimate line that had been displaced by legal technicalities and political manipulation. The atmosphere within the Tower grew increasingly tense as the full implications of Richard's campaign became clear to those who served the royal household. Servants who had once competed for the honor of attending the future king now found themselves wondering whether their continued association with the deposed princes might endanger their own futures. The machinery of royal ceremony and protocol gradually ground to a halt as it became unclear whether the boys in the Tower were still royal princes or merely high-ranking prisoners whose status remained to be determined by forces beyond their control. On June 25th, just 3 days after Shah's sermon, and 25 days after Edward V had been escorted to the Tower as king, representatives of the nobility, clergy, and commons gathered at the Guildhall to formally request that Richard accept the crown. The document they presented, known as the Petition of the Three Estates, summarized all the allegations against Edward IV's marriage and formally declared his children illegitimate and unable to inherit the throne. The petition claimed to represent the will of the entire kingdom, though it was signed primarily by men who had already demonstrated their support for Richard's cause and whose own positions depended on his favor. The ceremony at the Guildhall was carefully choreographed to create the appearance of a spontaneous and unanimous request from the realm's representatives, though the outcome had been predetermined, and the participants had little real choice in the matter. Richard initially demurred, expressing reluctance to accept such a heavy burden, but his protests were clearly pro forma gestures designed to suggest that the crown was being pressed upon him rather than seized by force. After allowing himself to be persuaded by the assembled worthies, he graciously accepted their petition and agreed to assume the throne as Richard III, king by right of birth and law rather than by conquest or usurpation. The speed with which these events unfolded left little time for organized opposition to develop, which was precisely what Richard and his supporters had intended. By moving quickly from Hastings' execution to the allegations of illegitimacy to the formal petition for Richard's accession, they had created a momentum that carried all before it and made resistance seem both futile and treasonous. Anyone who might have challenged the proceedings found themselves faced with a fait accompli that appeared to have the support of all the major institutions of English government and society. The transformation of Richard from Lord Protector to King Richard III was complete, accomplished through a combination of violence, legal manipulation, and political theatre that demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned in medieval England. He had not simply seized the throne through military force, though the threat of violence had been essential to his success. Instead, he had systematically destroyed the legal and moral foundations of his nephew's claim while constructing an alternative narrative that portrayed his own accession as both necessary and legitimate. The fate of Edward V and his brother now hung in the balance, their future dependent on the calculations of a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his ambitions. They remained in the Tower, their status transformed from royal residents to political prisoners, while their uncle consolidated his hold on power and began the process of establishing his new dynasty. The boys who had once been the hope of the Yorkist line had become its greatest liability, living reminders of the claims that Richard had worked so hard to discredit. As the summer of 1483 progressed, those who moved in court circles began to notice subtle changes in the treatment of the two princes. Their access to the Tower's gardens became more restricted, their visitors fewer and more carefully screened. The elaborate household that had once surrounded them was gradually dismantled, with many servants dismissed or reassigned to other duties. Most ominously, sightings of the boys themselves became increasingly rare, leading to whispered speculation about their health, their spirits, and ultimately their survival. The machinery of royal government that Richard now controlled had little use for the deposed princes, whose continued existence served no practical purpose and created ongoing risks for the new regime. They could not be released, as they would immediately become focal points for opposition movements. They could not be publicly executed, as that would confirm the worst suspicions about Richard's character and methods. But they could not be allowed to live indefinitely, as their presence would always remind the kingdom of the legitimacy they represented and the violence that had displaced them. In this impossible situation, where political necessity demanded a solution that conventional justice could not provide, the stage was set for the final act of this tragedy. The boys who had disappeared from public view would soon disappear from history itself, leaving behind only questions, rumors, and the haunting echo of footsteps in empty corridors that grew fainter with each passing day until they ceased altogether. In the suffocating heat of August 1483, as summer's grip tightened around the stone walls of the Tower of London, the two young princes found themselves prisoners in all but name, their world steadily contracting until it consisted of little more than the inner apartments of the White Tower and the increasingly watchful eyes of their guards. The boys who had once roamed the vast estates of Ludlow Castle now measured their domain in footsteps between barred windows, their royal status having become not a protection, but a death sentence, written in political necessity and signed by the uncle who had sworn to defend them. The transformation of Edward IV and Richard, Duke of York, from honored guests to isolated captives, occurred with the same methodical precision that had characterized Richard III's entire campaign for the throne. There were no dramatic moments of revelation, no sudden changes in their treatment that might have alarmed observers or created uncomfortable questions. Instead, their freedom was eroded incrementally, each restriction presented as a reasonable security measure, until the accumulated weight of these small limitations had effectively transformed the tower from palace to prison. Contemporary observers noted that the princes continued to appear occasionally in the tower's gardens during the early weeks of July, though their activities were increasingly supervised and their movements more constrained. Dominic Mancini, the Italian diplomat whose eyewitness account provides our most reliable contemporary evidence, recorded that they could sometimes be seen shooting arrows and playing games, their childish laughter a poignant counterpoint to the adult political machinations that were determining their fate. Yet even these innocent diversions carried an undertone of tragedy, as those who watched them understood that these might be among the last carefree moments the boys would ever experience. Dr. John Argentine, Edward V's personal physician, became an unwitting chronicler of the young king's psychological deterioration as the summer progressed. The doctor reported that his patient had grown increasingly melancholy and withdrawn, spending hours in prayer and confession, as though preparing his soul for an ordeal he sensed but could not name. Edward, despite his youth, possessed an intelligence sophisticated enough to understand the political dynamics that had stripped him of his crown, and his conversations with Argentine revealed a boy struggling to comprehend how divine appointment and royal blood could prove so fragile against human ambition and legal manipulation. The physician's accounts paint a heartbreaking portrait of a child forced to confront mortality at an age when most boys would be concerned with horses, hunting, and the mastery of courtly skills. Edward spoke frequently of death, not with the morbid fascination of the young, but with the resigned acceptance of someone who had been made to understand that his continued existence served no purpose in the new order that his uncle was constructing. According to Argentine, the boy king sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. Words that suggest either remarkable prescience or access to information that made his fate horrifyingly clear. Meanwhile, his younger brother Richard remained largely innocent of the full implications of their situation, his 9-year-old mind still capable of finding joy in simple pleasures despite their increasingly constrained circumstances. The contrast between the brothers during these final weeks was particularly poignant, with Edward bearing the psychological burden of understanding their danger while trying to protect Richard from the same knowledge. Contemporary accounts suggest that the older boy took on an almost paternal role, organizing games and diversions that might distract his brother from their growing isolation and the diminishing number of familiar faces in their daily routine. The systematic removal of the princess's household staff began in earnest during late July, as Richard III's government quietly reassigned servants whose loyalty might prove problematic or whose knowledge of the boy's circumstances could become inconvenient. The elaborate retinue that had once surrounded Edward V as the Prince of Wales was gradually replaced by a smaller group of carefully selected attendants whose primary qualification was absolute discretion rather than any particular skill in royal service. This process of staff reduction was presented as an economy measure, a reasonable streamlining of expenses for boys who were no longer heir to the throne, but its true purpose was to minimize the number of witnesses to whatever was being planned for the prince's future. By August, the prince's access to the outside world had been reduced to almost nothing, their visitors limited to a handful of carefully vetted officials, and their movements restricted to the innermost chambers of the White Tower. The boys who had once held court and received delegations of nobles now found themselves cut off from all news of the outside world, dependent on their increasingly sparse retinue for even basic information about events beyond their stone walls. This isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their treatment, transforming them from participants in the world of politics and power into passive objects whose fate would be determined entirely by others. The last confirmed sighting of the princes came from sources that vary in their details, but agree on the essential fact that by late August or early September 1483, Edward V and his brother had simply vanished from public view. Some accounts place their final appearance in the Tower's gardens, where they were reportedly seen playing together in what observers remembered as an unusually subdued manner. Others suggest that they were moved to different quarters within the Tower complex, ostensibly for their greater security, but actually to facilitate whatever solution Richard's government had decided upon for the problem they represented. What makes these final sightings particularly haunting is their ordinariness, the complete absence of drama or ceremony that might have marked the end of two young lives that had once promised to shape England's future. There were no farewell speeches, no final appearances before crowds of subjects, no recognition that history was witnessing the last moments of a royal line that could trace its ancestry back through centuries of English kings. Instead, the boys simply faded from the historical record with the quiet desperation of children who understood too late that their royal blood had become their death warrant. The political context that made their deaths necessary was established by the rebellion that erupted in October 1483, though the connection between the prince's disappearance and the uprising that followed has been debated by historians for centuries. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, the man who had been Richard III's most important supporter during his seizure of power, suddenly and dramatically switched sides, becoming the nominal leader of a conspiracy that aimed to overthrow the king he had helped to create. The timing and motivation of Buckingham's betrayal remain mysterious, but the most compelling explanation is that he had learned something about the fate of the princes that so horrified him that he could no longer serve the man responsible. Buckingham's rebellion was ostensibly launched to restore Edward V to the throne, but the conspiracy quickly evolved into something more complex when rumors began circulating that the young king and his brother were already dead. At this point, the rebellion's focus shifted to supporting Henry Tudor's claim to the crown, contingent upon his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, the Princess Atz's eldest sister, thereby uniting the rival claims of Lancaster and York. This transformation from a restoration movement to a dynastic revolution suggests that the conspirators had received information that made Edward V's restoration impossible, though whether this information was accurate or merely a convenient fiction remains one of history's great mysteries. The speed with which the rebellion's aims changed from restoring Edward V to replacing him with Henry Tudor provides the most compelling circumstantial evidence that the princes were indeed dead by autumn 1483. Political conspiracies of this magnitude required extensive planning and coordination, and it seems unlikely that such efforts would have been redirected unless the conspirators had compelling reasons to believe that the original plan was no longer viable. The fact that even Elizabeth Woodville, the prince's own mother, appears to have supported Henry Tudor's bid for the throne suggests that she too had reason to believe her sons were beyond rescue. Contemporary foreign observers noted the rumors of the prince's deaths with a mixture of horror and fascination, recognizing that England had crossed a line that would forever change the nature of royal succession in that kingdom. Guillaume de Rochefort, the French chancellor, warned his own king about the fate that had befallen Edward IV and Richard, using their disappearance as a cautionary tale about the dangers facing young monarchs in an age of political violence. These foreign accounts provide crucial independent confirmation that news of the princes' deaths had spread beyond England's borders by late 1483, though the exact details of what had happened remained murky even to well-informed diplomatic observers. The manner of the princes' deaths, if they indeed died in 1483, remains one of history's most debated questions, with theories ranging from murder by suffocation to poisoning to starvation. Thomas More's account, written decades later and based on alleged confessions extracted under torture, describes a midnight murder carried out by hired assassins who smothered the boys with pillows before burying their bodies beneath a staircase in the tower. This version has the dramatic appeal of a perfect crime, complete with professional killers and secret burials, but it was written long after the events it purports to describe, and by an author whose sources were highly partisan. More disturbing than the various theories about how the boys died is the consideration of the psychological torture they must have endured during their final weeks or months in the tower. Whether they were killed quickly in a moment of political expedience or died slowly through deliberate neglect, they would have spent their last days in the knowledge that they had been abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The boy who had been anointed as Edward V would have understood that his divine appointment meant nothing against human treachery, while his younger brother would have experienced the gradual dissolution of everything that had given his short life meaning and security. The disappearance of the princes created a vacuum in the historical record that has been filled by centuries of speculation, propaganda, and wishful thinking, but the most likely explanation remains the simplest. They were murdered on Richard III's orders, sometime between August and October 1483, their deaths necessitated by the political logic that made their continued existence incompatible with their uncle's security on the throne. While Richard may not have personally wielded the weapons that ended their lives, the responsibility for their deaths rests ultimately with the man who created the circumstances that made murder the only practical solution to the problem they represented. The psychological profile of a man capable of ordering the deaths of his own nephews reveals the complete corruption of natural affection by political ambition, a transformation that medieval observers found particularly horrifying because it violated the fundamental bonds of family loyalty that were supposed to provide stability in an uncertain world. Richard III had shown himself capable of extraordinary loyalty to his brother Edward IV, serving him faithfully for over 2 decades and never wavering in his support, even during the darkest moments of the Wars of the Roses. Yet this same capacity for devotion, when redirected toward his own ambitions, became the engine of a ruthlessness that ultimately consumed the very children he had once sworn to protect. The cover-up that followed the princes' deaths was as methodical as the murders themselves, involving the systematic destruction of evidence, the silencing of witnesses, and the construction of alternative narratives that might explain their disappearance without implicating those responsible. The boys' bodies were never displayed, never given the public funeral that might have provided closure while also confirming their deaths. Instead, they simply vanished from the historical record as though they had never existed, their erasure from public consciousness as complete as their physical elimination from the world of the living. The discovery of 2 small skeletons beneath a staircase in the White Tower during renovations in 1674 provided tantalizing physical evidence that might confirm the traditional account of the prince's fate, but the crude examination techniques of the 17th century could not definitively establish the age, sex, or identity of the remains. Modern scientific analysis might be able to resolve these questions, but political sensitivities have prevented the comprehensive testing that could finally solve this historical mystery. The bones rest today in Westminster Abbey, their true identity as uncertain as the exact circumstances of the deaths they may represent. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the prince's story is how completely their individual personalities and potential contributions to English history were overshadowed by the political necessities that led to their deaths. Edward V showed signs of the intelligence and political awareness that might have made him an effective king, while his brother Richard possessed the charm and vitality that could have served the monarchy well in the ceremonial and diplomatic roles that younger royal sons traditionally filled. Instead of developing these talents in service to their kingdom, they became victims of the very system they had been born to lead. The legacy of their deaths extended far beyond the immediate political crisis of 1483, establishing precedents for royal violence that would echo through English history for generations to come. The idea that kings could be deposed and murdered with legal justification became embedded in English political consciousness, contributing to the constitutional conflicts that would eventually lead to the execution of Charles I and the temporary abolition of the monarchy itself. In destroying Edward V and his brother, Richard III had inadvertently weakened the very institution he sought to control, demonstrating that royal authority depended ultimately on consent rather than divine appointment. The mystery surrounding the prince's deaths has proven more enduring than any monument Richard III might have erected to his own reign, transforming two forgotten boys into symbols of innocence, destroyed by political ambition. Their story continues to fascinate because it crystallizes eternal questions about power, morality, and the price of survival in a world where human bonds prove weaker than political necessity. In the Tower of London, where tourists now stand in the rooms where Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, spent their final days, the silence speaks more eloquently than any chronicle about the fate that befell two children, whose only crime was being born too close to a throne that their uncle coveted more than he valued their lives. The prince's disappearance marked not just the end of two young lives, but the death of an entire vision of England's future, one in which legitimate succession and family loyalty might have provided stability in a kingdom exhausted by decades of civil war. Instead, their murders inaugurated a new era of political violence and constitutional uncertainty that would define English governance for generations to come. In the stone chambers where they drew their last breaths, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, became not just victims of their uncle's ambition, but symbols of the terrible price that political power demands from those too innocent to understand its true nature. Their story remains unfinished because the questions it raises about the relationship between power and morality, between family loyalty and political necessity, continue to resonate in our own time. The boys who vanished into the tower's darkness remind us that behind every political calculation lie human lives, and that the costs of ambition are often paid by those least able to defend themselves. In their silence, we hear the echoes of all the victims of political violence, whose stories have been lost to the convenience of those who survived to write the histories that followed.